No one was true. Fuck. No one was truly disappointed with meeting a new species. Making sure that we are not alone in the universe was both exciting and terrifying at the same time. Kind of like when you first get into a fight. But it was a little disappointing to find out that you're basically talking to glorified house cats. Now, that is what most of the human race actually looked at their new friends as, but in actuality, they were very, very intelligent, although they did constantly try to show up themselves. It was this way because in their culture, dominance, especially among the males, was a big deal, similar to the way humans were back in the day when you think about it. However, this got into play many times when you would see one of the females, which I will just call the meows for here on out, since most human tongues cannot pronounce their actual species name. In fact, to the human ear, it sounds like a cat howling and coughing up a hairball at the same time. So, the meows many times were actually treated like house cats just out of sheer accidental anything. It really was an accident most of the time. However, if one of the female meows got close and she, say, fell asleep on one of the human's thighs and he simply started to pet her, yes, they would start purring. This was a very large sign of affection for them. And many of the males would seem, well, angry and very territorial, believing that the human was making a move on one of their females, and immediately there would be a fight. Now, granted, most humans were pretty easily able to take them down as long as they were able to strike, but the meows did have a set of retractable claws just like any other cat, which made things difficult, however not impossible. If you have ever been attacked by a cat, most of what they'll do is grab a hold of you and try to bite, just like any other feline, but this is not a good idea against any type of human who's not even caring if they do any type of serious damage. A few cracks to the side of the cranium with a closed fist is more than enough to get one of them to let go or reconsider their options. In any case, this usually led to some sort of incident where everyone was looking into it and it simply came down to, oh, I didn't know that was a bad thing. Sorry. You never use the phrase my bad because actually the translation through the translator was actually an insult to them. We found this out by accident as well. However, the translator seemed to work just fine after a while as long as you kept away from slang, and they had to do the same thing too. They had their own curse words, of course, which the translator was having difficulty with each one, as just like humans, they had different type of words for, well, excrement and mating. And yes, they always had some sort of insult specific to male and female, just like we do. Which is why, after a while of working with them, once you could get past the size difference and how they look, of course, it was actually very easy to work alongside of them. And in many cases, crews were attached. Though they were not nearly as advanced as humans, they caught up fairly quickly. They realized that they couldn't handle something as strong as, say, a .45 caliber, but you would see them walking around with their rifles that were basically glorified .22 long rifles. And in that case, yeah, that can still do damage. Might take a few, but you're still going to get the job done. They understood this, and we understood not to piss them off, so everything kind of worked out. And we believed that this was going to be a kind of symbiotic relationship when you think about it for the longest of times. But we did continue to search out and look at different planets, and most ships were simply looking for some sort of score, some sort of new mineral, some sort of new plant, some sort of new anything that they could sell, swap, or trade. It was just the way of things. Commerce was still commerce, and trying to make a name for yourself was still there. This is where our next chapter truly begins. In Deep Patrol, one of the ships found a semi-garden planet. It was covered over 60% with rivers and lakes, and another 15% with oceans that seem to crisscross around. But when you look close, you realize, yes, these are a difference of salt and fresh water. It was strange, but it was beautiful. There were beaches everywhere, just everywhere. You literally had to walk over, pick an island, and it was beautiful. Lush and green, anything that was above the waterline and anything below the waterline seemed to be teeming with life. The biosensors were just going off like crazy, and it was very quickly assumed that they could land on the planet. As they brought their ship down, the sensors came back and they did realize it was a breathable atmosphere. Very breathable, actually. In fact, it was kind of thick, which would make it difficult for you to actually breathe it after a while, as you would have to thin it out to make sure your lungs wouldn't fill up with water. But at least for a few days, they could be on the planet. The ship came down and seemed to glide almost effortlessly, using the 0-point generator as its own power source and using the gravimetrics to keep it aloft. It seemed to quietly, almost silently, come down to one island, extend its landing gear, and slowly touch down. Not reading any large biosignatures on top of the planet, i.e., there was no large fauna anywhere. The flora, though, was just incredibly dense in most areas. There were still small fields which allowed the ship to land, but still, this planet was seemingly a paradise. No issues, no animals bigger than about the size of a squirrel seemed to be going around. Then they double checked. Oh, no, wait. We see here there are some about the size of a... Is that a warthog? Oh, no, yeah, about the size of a pig. They seemed to understand that these were running around seemingly predator and prey animals. So they would still have to take caution. But the fact of the matter is that they outsized all these animals, and seeing a human for the first time would make any animal run. Hell, even on Earth, most animals will not go toe-to-toe with a human, even if he's unarmed. You simply have to raise your arms and scream real loud, and that's what happens. Eventually, they spread off across the island, looking at each of the beaches, using their equipment to scan everything. The main group decided to set up their own camp just outside so that they could actually breathe unrecycled air for the first time in weeks. Oh, it was beautiful. They reached out and they would have to scan a flower to make sure it wasn't poisonous, but as soon as it was cleared, they would take a whiff. It was almost like a light perfume. Not overpowering like you would when you pass by those shops, but just very light but very pleasant. All the flowers seemed to have a strange purple or pink to them, sometimes the occasional blue. And there was also green. Green was everywhere. Anything that wasn't a beach, a flower, or water was green. The trunks of the trees were green instead of brown. This amazed everyone, as they realized this is one of the reasons why the air was so thick, but so oxygen rich. It was incredible. The crew felt amazing. While they walked around, they began to scan along the beaches and realized that the rivers are teeming with life, so much so that they wouldn't be able to get a good reading even if they stuck the sensors down in there. The only way they would be able to check anything is if they caught something and brought it to the surface to scan it. So that is what they tried to do. They didn't have any nets, so a few of them hooked up fishing poles, or made their own, and they tried to figure out some sort of bait. They tried everything and eventually decided that they would use their own type of rations to see if they could snag anything. This seemed to work very well, as they were able to pull out several different types of fish. And yes, they did look like fish. It was amazing. How could they? Seriously, what are the odds? They wondered if these fish could talk like their, well, feline friends. But to no avail. They couldn't get any type of reaction at all. Even when they dunked the fish in some sort of holding tank, they tried to get some sort of intelligence out of them, and nope, they were just fish. Most of them seemingly set up for speed, as they looked pretty much like stripers, narrow, lined up to go as fast as they could down the river. One or two were set up to look like ambush predators, almost like pike. Well, why not? They decided, well, when in Rome, and they feasted on the fish that night. The fire they created was able to be seen across half the continent. It was so large. In fact, they got cursed out by their XO because he told them to not burn the place to the ground. They did end up cooking their fish and getting their fill. And later that night, a young ensign walked to the beach. He had to relieve himself, and he figured the best place to do that was going to be either against a tree or into the water. He simply opened his trousers and let her rip. As he shook himself off, he suddenly realized he heard some other water moving, and this was not a stream of water. He realized what this was, as he grew up on Earth, and he had grown up in the countryside, so he knew all the sounds to listen to. Immediately, he put himself away, and then he drew his pistol in one hand and his flashlight in the other. And he started looking around. Something was out here, something besides him. He looked around left and right. The brightness of the two moons that were visible, the third was on the other side of the planet, made it to the point where he almost didn't need the flashlight, but he wanted to see the other shoreline. As he grazed across to look to see what was on the other side of the river, his light saw something in the river just slightly, and then it went down into the water. He immediately started backing up away. He knew the dangers of crocodiles and alligators, ambush predators. If they caught him even on the shoreline, they'd have him in the water before he was able to scream, before he was able to even fire a shot, and he was not going to take that risk. He began to sweep back and forth and back and forth. Again, his light would just barely catch something, and down into the water it would go. So just as a thought, he clicked off everything. He kept his pistol out, but he kept looking. As he looked across, shadows seemed to come out of the water. One here, two over there. Oddly enough, they didn't look like they were aggressive. He pulled up his flashlight again, but he didn't turn it on. He simply waited. He watched. He stayed in position, and he listened as close as he possibly could. He didn't want to be snuck up on, slowly moving his head and his eyes around to make sure nothing else was coming. He kept his look out onto the water, suddenly wishing he had grabbed his radio. Realizing that running was probably a bad idea, he stayed put. He stayed standing there for what seemed like hours, but may have only been a few minutes. And then what was in the water submerged again. These semi-round balls that seemed to be up out of the water. He couldn't see more than silhouette, but he knew something was there. He waited a few more minutes for them to go away, and then he slowly backed away, clicked on his flashlight again, and went back and forth just to make sure. He didn't hear anything, but he worried. He kept his pistol out as he started to get away, and as soon as his flashlight was no longer touching the water, he turned around and as best he could bolted back to camp and told everybody about what he saw. Everybody immediately got up as they were worried what the hell was out there. What did he see? He tried to give a description as best he could, but let's face it, if you couldn't see it very well, what can you do? A lot of people thought he was sleepwalking or something, or maybe the fish had made him go delirious or something, but nobody else was having any symptoms. However, they would be placing a guard for that night. The next morning, they all looked around. They kept in pairs mostly, but every once in a while, one would go off on their own. This same ensign ended up in the same spot, but this time, he just stands there and watches. He watches across to see if there's anything else. If whatever was out there would show up, or maybe it was just nocturnal, he didn't know. If there's a nocturnal predator, they really need to stay in the ship at night. But nobody wanted to do that. They were enjoying their vacation too much. As he looked around, he suddenly realized that he was staying pretty far from the beach, pretty far from the sand. So he simply walked out. He kept his pistol in its holster, the knife on the other side, but he made sure they were unbuckled so he could draw them quickly if he needed to. But he walked close. He looked into the water. What the hell was out there? He checked his bioscanner. The bioscanner noted that there was something below the surface, but he couldn't see. They sent a few drones up to try and see, but it seemed like every time drones got close, something that was in the water would either swim away very quickly or it would dive into the muck where the bioscanners and the cameras just couldn't see it. They didn't understand. He didn't have any drones at that point. But just as he got to the edge of the water, he saw ripples. But these were not the ripples of a predator coming. These were not trying to be sneaky. These ripples seemed to be moving slightly to one way, then slightly to another, but they weren't coming any closer. It was as though whatever it was waiting for him to step into the water, but he wasn't silly enough to do that. He remembered all his times in the bayou where they kept saying, if there's a gator in the water, you don't go in there. So he wasn't even going to be considering it. He was already way closer to the water than he wanted to be. But looking out, he could see that several other different ripples were happening as well. Some would go up or downstream, and it was strange just to watch them. But nothing ever actually breached the surface. But he sat there and watched. As he did, he slowly reached for his comms, and he radioed in, letting them know that he sees some sort of strange movement and where he was. His command told him to stay put and let him know, keep the channel open in case something happens. Roger, sir, is all they got back. They didn't have anyone to spare, as they were still looking into different items in this planet to see if it was safe for habitation and colonization. As he looked out, he saw something that was straight out of the movies. He saw the ripple come towards him, but then it seemed to stop. And then it moved forward just slightly. And then it moved forward just slightly more. And then a little more, and something began to breach the water. He felt his hand reach down towards his pistol as his other hand clenched his radio. He keyed it very slightly. Sir, something's coming out of the water. In his earpiece, all he heard was, "We'll be there in 2 minutes. Is it hostile?" "Unknown, sir." "Everyone, clear the channel. Make sure you head over to location," and they gave the grid. And he could hear in the distance people rushing through the woods. But of course the foliage was so thick, it was going to make it difficult for anyone to get to him. So he waited. And what came out of the water would be something he wished he had on camera. Oh wait, he does have one. Reaching up, hitting the button and turning it on, he saw as something slowly walked out of the water towards him, the head piercing the surface first, coming up with two piercing eyes that seemed to have some sort of yellowish tinge to them as they came up and moved forward. Then the rest of the head pierced up through, slowly walking towards him, seemingly walking up the sandbar itself, up the beach. How the hell is this possible, is what he was thinking. Am I losing my mind? Were the only thoughts going through his head. Well, that is, until the shoulders and the torso began to actually reach out of the water. Then the blood was rushing out of his brain and going somewhere else. What he saw was clearly female. It was almost human-shaped. It was a humanoid for sure. As the rest of the body came out, it could see its hands. Its hands had seemingly 3 digits, but he could see that they were webbed in between the second and third digits on the hands. He also looked, as it moved its thumb a little bit, that there was an extra piece of webbing there as well. What the hell? As it continued to move up, this naked thing moved closer and closer to him. He began to reach down more and more towards his pistol, gripping the handle, but making sure his finger did not go inside the trigger well. Whatever this is, he didn't want to scare it off. It walked up towards him, and as the hips cleared out, he saw that it did in fact have a strange tail. This was not to be unexpected, considering it's an aquatic species. Clearly it can breathe underwater. As it moved closer, he could see that the sides of its head, back behind where the human jaw would be, were gills. Gills that seemed to be open as it was up, but then slowly seemed to close as this thing simply leaned its head forward a little bit and seemed to let water drip out of its mouth. And then, to his absolute amazement, it breathed in a whole bunch of air. With that sound, he had a death grip, completely white-knuckling his pistol, but not truly, pulling it out. As he watched, it continued to walk up to him. As it got about within arm's reach, he began to back up a little bit, just to be safe. He didn't know what this thing was going on, what it was about. As he could see everything above its ankles, he was amazed and stunned at what he saw. The moment between the two would have lasted longer if it wasn't for the "What the fuck?" that came from behind him. He slowly turned and looked, and a few of his mates had actually showed up with rifles in hand. He simply raised his left hand, still holding his comms, up so that they knew to calm down. He said, "Whoa, whoa, 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 whoa." With that, they kept their rifles down. They didn't raise them. And the ensign slowly lowered his hand back down. He brought the comms up to his face and told everybody, "I don't think they're hostile. Stand down. Do not fire. I say again, do not fire." The commander got on the line. "We'll be the judge of that. We'll be there in 1 minute." "Sir, I've already got backup." With that, he could hear the other conversations kick in, letting them know that yes, there is a female something standing here. It's just staring at them. Then the ensign had an idea. He slowly released the hand that was holding his pistol, held out his hand in a normal human handshake. The thing looked at his hand as though trying to assess what was going on. The thing in front of him, this strange, almost gray purple that was going on, seemed surprised at what was going on. It didn't expect anything. It didn't say anything. And the ensign simply said, "Hello." The thing looked at him as though vocalization was a strange thing. It obviously hurt him, as it seemed to pull its head back and up a little bit. Kind of their version of the same confused look when we tilt our heads sideways. The creature then seemed to mimic the movement by sticking out its hand. The hand with the ball of his fingers seemed to hold them tight, as though it was trying to knife hand. The ensign simply moved his hand over, realizing he couldn't shake hands with this thing, simply slowly grabbed a hold of her wrist, at the old-fashioned way of actually shaking hands with someone. It also wrapped its hand around his wrist, not tight, but just a little bit, and then shook it up and down 1 time. The creature looked confused at this motion, looked at the hands, and then the ensign simply let go and put his hand back to the side, making sure that she let go of his arm at the same time. She then seemed to have a strange look on her face. It wasn't really a scowl. It was kind of what the hell look in her eyes. We didn't know what this meant. He didn't know what it meant. No one did. Everyone just watched in amazement. Everyone was making sure their camera was on to make sure that first contact with a species that was clearly able to understand what was going on was videoed very, very closely. With this, the female simply slapped her tail onto the surface of the water and then screeched something, some sort of, it sounded like Morse code, but like somebody trying to screech like a young child. And with that, other movement from the water as others came up. More and more of their kind seemed to breach the water, men and women alike of similar complexion, but not the same, were moving up towards him, up towards the ensign. By this time, the captain had actually got there and began to move up slowly and asked the ensign what the hell was going on. The ensign exclaimed that she had shown up and they had just shook hands. They don't seem hostile. With that, the captain walked up next to him, stood as tall as possible, reached out his hand to who he thought would be the leader. And with that, 4 of them reached out and grabbed his hand and shook it really, really fast. They had seemed to watch the entire thing, but had completely lost the whole idea of a simple handshake. With that, the captain was a little perturbed, but tried not to laugh, as he didn't know if the human laugh would be considered an insult or what. He wasn't going to push his luck. This is first contact, after all, and things can get very touchy. As they looked around, others shone up. And with that, the captain called for a translator. One of the translators brought up and shown to each of them. He tried to mimic how it's going to change the voice so they can understand, but they just looked kind of strange. But with that, they started giving those odd sounds to each other. But the odd sounds, instead of sounding like some sort of strange yelping noise, sounded more like a language. A strange language, of course, with a whole bunch of clicks and whistles put in there. But it was still a language, and the translator was immediately starting to understand it. It was trying to put it together as fast as possible, and thankfully, the engineers are no slouches. After barely a minute, it began to give a green signal, which meant that it could understand part of the language. He gave it another minute or two of them talking to each other before he got any type of text of what it actually was. He could get bits and pieces, and it would take a long time for the translator to figure out the entire language. However, he had something. Clicking on a button, he simply spoke into the translator. "Hello. My name's Captain Kleiner." With that, it gave the clicks and whistles along with the language, and all the aliens seemed to stop and look at it, as though they realized that it was translating their speech. With that, a very large male walked up, seemingly older, but it was hard to tell being this is a new species. Walked up, seemingly put a palm on the side of the female, seemingly to push her aside, but not actually shove her, just to show that he was in charge. And he began to speak. "Hello. I am Chieftain Kantadeha," the translator put out in his strong robotic voice. The male continued. "This is my daughter Shnisa. She was curious about you, and so are we. So I ask, who, what are you?"